Welcome to SDA Mastery, the podcast series hosted by Tania Gomez Consulting. In each episode, we'll be sharing valuable insights and tips that can help you learn the intricacies of specialist disability accommodation. We will demystify the entire SDA process, give you direct access to experts in the field, and help you to discover what life is like as an SDA provider. Whether you're thinking about leaping into SDA or you're looking to level up your existing NDIS business, you're in the right place. Come on in, let's explore the SDA space together. Hi Debbie, and welcome to our couch. Today we're talking about specialist disability accommodation, and the first thing that we're going to be talking about is where to start to invest in specialist disability accommodation. So I guess my first question for you is a really basic one. For someone who has only really heard about specialist disability accommodation and is really brand new as an investor, what actually is specialist disability accommodation?
Good question, Tania, and thank you for having me here. Really looking forward to this. Specialist disability accommodation is very high spec properties that have been designed for some of Australia's highest level disability, people with wheelchair requirements, other requirements, basically homes that will allow them to live with more independence and also allow the supports that they need, the carers who come in and give them day-to-day support, allow that support to be provided more efficiently and cost-effectively.
Right, okay. And the question that I get often is how is that different than the supports that they might receive in other areas of the NDIS?
So somebody with specialist disability accommodation funding is also likely to have supported independent living funding. So they need, they need at least 6 hours a day of person-to-person supports.
Right.
And so a lot of people will have SIL funding that don't have SDA funding. They don't need a property designed specially. However, a lot of them will need SDA as well. So the SDA is the bricks and mortar.
Yeah.
It's the actual property. And the SIL supports are separate to that, but also very much a part of the whole overriding process.
Yeah, of their package or their plan. Great. And so how is specialist disability accommodation funded by the government, in this case the NDIA? How do they fund it, and what does that look like?
Yeah. So somebody who believes they need to live in a specialist disability accommodation home will apply for the funding using their plan manager support coordinator to assist them getting together all of the documentation required. That, of course, then goes to the NDIA for them to determine whether this person does indeed need SDA, what level of funding they need, and that determination is made. The NDIA might believe they are best living in a home with shared supports, or they might need to live in an apartment on their own, whatever that looks like. And the funding that is then given to them within their plan is very much based on the location they live in, the type of property they live in, and also the type of dwelling that they need. When I say that, the type of design, rather, the SDA design. So there are 4 of them in the system. It starts at improved livability for people with maybe cognitive dysfunction. They just need assistance, wayfinding, luminous contrast around doors and things so that they can see their way better. They can easily find light switches and other elements in the house. The next level up is people with mainly wheelchair accessibility requirements, fully accessible. So someone who probably can still do a lot for themselves. Maybe they're a paraplegic and they need height adjustable bench tops, those sorts of things. And of course they need all the wider doorways and hallways, and rather than having ramps everywhere, everything's sort of more of a flat level to give them a much easier movement around their house.
Yeah. Okay.
The highest level, high physical support, is for people that have usually wheelchair accessibility requirements as well, but at a much higher level, they probably also need hoists. They might need full automation on doorways and windows, battery backup facility in case power goes out and they have life-saving equipment or that sort of thing. And then there's a sort of a standalone category which is robust, and that is for people generally with more of a psychosocial disability. So they need a home built tougher that will protect them, protect others. Soundproofing is a big part of that as well.
Yeah, right. So the NGOA funds a builder to build a house to a certain standard for a person with disability.
No.
So that seems logical. How does that process work?
Okay, so the NDIA does not fund the building of a property. They will fund, but when we said the participant has the funding in their plan, the payments that an investor will get or a builder will get to build a property come by way of the rent that they receive when a tenant is in place. So this happens after the construction. So an investor or a builder or developer has to fund that construction initially, then they will get the rent payments back, which are much higher than regular residential rent payments, to compensate for the extra cost in building these properties, because they do cost more than regular properties, and also the time it can take to get tenants in place. And they only get the money when there are tenants in place.
Yeah, okay. Right. So then there's a house that's built and a builder comes and builds a house and he builds it to certain standards that are approved, and the standards that are approved will determine the payments that he receives once a tenant's in place.
Yes, correct. It also is really important to understand that the payments that the participant or the tenant is funded for taken into account. So if a property is built to the highest level, high physical support, the owner is not automatically going to get the funding to that level. If a participant has improved livability funding, the lowest level, it's the lower of or the lesser of rule. So the owner of the property will only get the lower amount of funding that the participant is entitled to get.
Right, okay. So there could be an instance where they build a house at a higher level than the needs and they're being paid less than they had expected to receive.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. And so if you're looking to invest in SDA, how then do you go about calculating what your return would be on that investment?
There is, to start with, a calculator that the NDIA have available on their website. You can download it, punch in a few different variables, being the type of property, whether it's a house, an apartment, a villa, duplex, the location it's in, whether it's going to be for 2 tenants or 3 tenants or 1 tenant, and whether there are fire sprinklers, whether there's tax input credits are being claimed, a few other variables like that. And that will actually then shoot back the funding that a participant with that amount of funding will get. And therefore, if that participant lives in the home, the amount of rent, basically, that the owner will receive. The SDA funding is the major part of the amount, but they do actually get another additional amount of rent paid by the participant, which is their MRRC, the maximum reasonable rent contribution. And that's made up of their 25% of their disability support pension and their rental allowance.
Right, okay. And that goes to the SDA provider?
All of it goes to the SDA provider, who then take their fee and pass on the balance to the owner. And the fees are generally between 10 and 15% most providers will charge.
Okay, and so the provider, the SDA provider in this case, is then like a property manager.
Exactly.
So they come in and manage the property. So the house is built by a builder, funded by an investor. So the investment comes through, the house is built, an SDA provider is put in place to manage the property. An SDA participant comes along, and once the SDA participant is in place, the investor receives rent payments, as well as other payments.
SDA payments and rent payments.
SDA payments and rent payments, and that becomes their return on investment.
That's right.
Right, okay. that kind of makes sense.
I know it's very different to a regular investment property because we say it's literally like you're buying an investment property with a business in it, because that is effectively what is happening. You're not running the business, someone else is, but it's a commercial property.
Yeah, right.
In a lot of ways. Yeah.
So what are the advantages of investing in SDA?
Obviously, the high returns is how the government has incentivised private investment into SDA by offering these returns to encourage it. So you are going to get a much higher return if you build the right property in the right location. Yeah. And the other benefit, of course, is that you are providing a home for somebody who really needs a specialised property for them to live in, to give them that freedom and independence that they wouldn't otherwise have. And there is such a high demand and such a need for these types of properties.
And how long would a participant be a tenant for? How long do they stay in the home? Is this their home forever?
It's their home forever. It's their forever home for sure. Yeah.
Okay, so I heard somebody else recently compare it to something like defence housing, where you may have a contract with the government where you're not guaranteed, but you can be pretty sure that you'll have a tenant in there and you'll be receiving an above market rent rate for having that property. Is that a similar comparison?
It's similar, but you're not guaranteed the income. You only get paid when there are tenants in place. But you do have I guess the only guarantee is that the government will provide these rental payments when there are tenants in place for 20 years.
20 years.
Yeah.
And at 20 years?
At 20 years, the property will revert to existing SDA stock. Now, that's still with the current rates that existing SDA properties are getting. It's still well above regular residential returns. So it's still a good investment, but it's not anywhere near as high as the current SDA amounts.
And what are some of the risks of investing in SDA properties?
A lot of risks. It's a very high risk investment, and we spend a lot of time educating investors that they need to understand all these different risks, and the main ones being lack of tenancy. Yeah. Because if you don't have tenants in place, you don't get any money. You get no income. So it's really important that you are building the right kind of property for the demand in the area, and you're also building it above the minimum specifications. You're building it future-proofed. So it's going to grow with the participants and their needs in the future. It's going to be built to much higher standards than other people's properties in the same area, so that your property is going to be the choice rather than another one that doesn't have the same bells and whistles, if you like. Yeah,
right. And so how can somebody, if the biggest risk is not having a tenant, how does someone start to research who has the onus of figuring out what is the right location and what is the right design standard in that area, and what is the demand? Is the onus on the investor or the builder or the SDA provider? Who's responsible for making those decisions? Because they seem like really important ones.
Very important, yeah. Look, the onus is ultimately on the investor to do their research and make sure there is demand in that area, and there are tools that they can utilise to find that out. The onus is also on the provider, because they're not going to get paid either if they've got a property they're managing that has no tenants. So that's the complicated part of it. The most complicated part of the whole process is finding out what the demand is, and then also connecting with the providers, the SDA providers and the SIL providers who have the tenants. Yeah. Now, when we talk about the demand, the NDIA put out some really comprehensive data every quarter on the current supply and demand all across Australia, broken down into different regions, the SA4, the SA3 regions. That's the statistical areas that are the ABS statistical areas. And that gives us a pretty good idea of the number of participants in any one area, whether they're looking for a property, whether they're living in a property, whether they are looking for a high physical support or a robust or whatnot. And it also gives us the supply. So how many existing and legacy properties, which are the old style disability homes, how many new build, and whether they are units houses, group homes, villas, whether they're for 2 tenants, 3 tenants, 1 tenant, whatever the mix is. And they also give us a general, not a very in-depth view of the pipeline data. And that is based on when a builder is getting ready to build an SDA property, they have to have their plans submitted, assessed before construction starts. They have to submit that assessment to the NDIA. So from that information, the NDIA extrapolate the pipeline data. Not every single one of those properties will be built, but we assume that the vast majority will be. So unfortunately, that's very broad areas that pipeline information is provided, but it does still give us some idea of what the current supply is and what the potential future supply is. So you take all of that, look at the demand, look at the supply to work out where it's needed, where the gaps are.
Okay. And I've heard the term used a lot around anchor tenants. So what is an anchor tenant?
Yeah, an anchor tenant will be the first tenant that moves in. So the process generally will run like this. Once you've got a property going to construction, if the builder hasn't already tied up with an SDA provider to potentially have participants already lined up, we always recommend engage a provider really early on in that build process so that they can start looking for the anchor tenant. It can take 9 months to find the correct tenant for that property. And it's also important to get the anchor tenant right, because if it's a multi-tenant property, the tenants that move in after have to be compatible with that anchor tenant. So it's really important to get a good anchor tenant in who obviously is expected to be there for life, and then match subsequent tenant or tenants. Personality-wise as well as support-wise, because that's all got to match. Obviously, they've got to get on well. They're living in the same house, but their supports, the care requirements really need to be compatible as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's it doesn't seem like the data that is out there is something that is highly reliable. That, it seems like, I haven't looked at this data, but I've looked at lots of other government data, and it tends to be a little bit outdated, a little bit hypothetical, maybe not completely accurate in some areas. And if you're an investor that is making a decision to invest to create a return in an area based around a potential need, it seems like, at least I'm just risk adverse, but I would want to be doing a lot of research around getting a level of comfort myself around the location and the design.
Absolutely. And this is why the data is only one part of the story. You've really got to be talking to the providers on the ground, the SDA providers and the SIL providers, the care organisations who've got the participants, to find out what their need is. And, don't just talk to one, because they'll just have one little piece of the pie. You need to try and get as much information on the ground as you can. Who's got how many participants, what they're looking for, and really tie that in. And that is hard. That is difficult to get.
And why does the SDA process, you said it can take 9 months to find your anchor tenant. Why does it take 9 months?
A lot of the time, the participants might not even have the SDA funding in their plan. So they've got to go through that process. And that is generally a minimum 6 months. It can be a year and a half. If they have trouble getting that approval, they may get approval for a level lower than that they wish for the property that they're looking to move into, and they'll have to appeal that. So that appeal process can even stretch it out to longer than that. But on average, what we're seeing across Australia is that 9 months is a good amount of time to expect to get at first tenant in from when you start looking. So it can still take a few months after the property is completed. It's got to get its final SDA assessment and certificate of occupancy before anyone can move into the property. So you're still looking at least 2 months generally, if not 3, after completion before your tenant moves in. But that process really needs to start 6 months before that point.
Yeah, so there's lots of approval processes happening then. it seems like we've got the building, first and foremost, the house is being built, which, how long does that usually take?
6 months to 18 months.
Yeah, so you've got 6 to 18 months for the house to be built. You've got, from my experience, 12 to 18 months for the SDA provider to be approved as an SDA provider to be able to be the property manager. And then in parallel, you've got the NGOs participant going through a plan review to get the right level of funding, which is taking about 9 months. So is the idea that we start all of these things at the same time and hope that they finish around the same time so that it all comes together magically in the end?
I guess that would be the best case scenario. And that's, taking into account if the owner of the property also does want to be their own SDA provider, they don't need to be. They can engage a different SDA provider.
Engage an existing SDA provider.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, and we recommend, certainly for a lot of our mum and dad investors, or even developers who are looking at building a few small properties, it's something they may want to do, but it's very time consuming, expensive, and very high on the compliance side of things, that it may not be worth their time to go down that route.
Yeah, right. And so we've talked about a lot of different stakeholders, and I think for me and people that I talk to, this is where it gets confusing. There seems to be so many stakeholders. We have investors, SDA providers, we've got a builder, we've got an assessor, we have a SIL provider, and they all have really important roles. So if we start back with the investor, what responsibility or what do the investors need to do in this process? What's their role?
Obviously, investing the money, but also being educated and aware on the whole process. Really important they understand what they're getting into, because as we said, it's a high risk investment and there are so many plays. They need to understand how everything fits in. They need to understand how long it can take to get tenants in place. They need to understand the importance of the SDA assessment, that the property is built to the correct guidelines, which is not their responsibility, it's the builder's responsibility, but they still need to be aware of all those different things, and they need to be aware of the importance of the providers, the SIL and the SDA providers.
Right. Okay. And then what is the builder responsible for?
He is responsible for building that property to the SDA guidelines.
Okay.
So that it passes assessment.
Yeah, so that makes sense. That piece makes sense to me. Okay, and the SDA provider, what are they responsible for? Generally,
they are responsible for actually getting the participants in the property. Not always. They may rely on the SIL provider for that. There might already be participants lined up for the property that have been there from the beginning of the project. The builder may have family or whatnot who they're actually building for.
Right.
But generally they'll be responsible for procuring the participants, and of course they're responsible for managing the property and liaising with the support workers, the SIL workers, the SIL businesses, and looking after all the compliance of the ongoing SDA process.
Right. And then what is the assessor responsible for?
He is responsible for the first assessment that the plans meet SDA guidelines, and at the end of the build that he has to go back in and check everything off and make sure it has been built accurately to those guidelines.
Yeah, great. And then lastly, we've got the SIL provider. And what's their role?
Their role is providing the care to the participants in the house. So I think they get forgotten a lot. They're working in these properties. This is their workplace.
Yeah.
So they really need to be probably involved a lot earlier in the design stage. So, and this is happening more now. We're seeing that the designers, the builders, the architects are working with the care organisations to make sure that it does suit their requirements so that they can look after the participants, their clients, in the home better, and that they have a better work environment to do so.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess my question is then, you've got all of these different people with different responsibilities. They seem to a lay person like they're that you need an expert in each space. But I'm going to ask the question, could you be the investor and the builder and the SDA provider and the SIL provider and deliver an end-to-end solution? Does that happen?
Yes. I don't know that there'd be many organisations out there doing all four. Certainly quite a number of builders are building their own so they're putting up their own money to build it and become their own SDA provider.
Okay.
You're more likely going to see SDA providers and SIL providers being the same organisation, trying to keep those two operations quite separate, and the NDIA want to see that as being separate. They believe that there can be a potential for a conflict of interest when the same organisation does both. Yeah. It's not allowing the participant to have that choice and control necessarily. So there is a little bit of concern if someone is looking to do that. But I think to do all four, if they're a SIL organisation, they're also doing the SDA and they are building it and paying for it to be built. I mean, yes, there'd be some doing that as well. They're just got to be really careful about separating all those different areas and doing it right from the start.
Yeah, okay. I'm just thinking that most people, when they see an opportunity, go, well, I don't want one piece, I want to eat the whole apple.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess from my perspective, as an NGOs auditor, we like SDA and SIL to be separate because of the conflict, but also they're very different things.
Very.
A SIL provider is a care specialist that's great at supporting and providing care. A SDA provider as a property manager is great at maintaining the facility. They're very different roles.
They are.
And on a personal note, my husband is he's a building engineer, and he spent a long time in hospitals, and he was in charge of the facility for the hospital. So he could tell you about the fire sprinklers and the air conditioning and all the other things, the hard and the soft FM. But there's no way that his skills would be providing the supports to the patients inside the hospital. So that's kind of in my head, the model that I see is that managing the building is a very different skill set, a different person. They're not the same persona. Of course, a company big enough could hire people with those expertise.
Exactly.
And potentially that might be the model as SDA progresses into the future, but it does seem like chalk and cheese. So how well do all these stakeholders work together? Is it a very collaborative approach? Do they work together in harmony? Is that the ideal outcome? And is there any challenges that investors need to be aware of between all of these stakeholders?
Yeah, good question. I think in the early days, SDA is 5 years old now. So in the early days, it was all very much, I'm just doing my own thing and try and figure it all out. It's very much become clear that collaboration from all the different stakeholders is vital to making this work. And that's happening a lot more now.
Great.
So yeah, people are working together and they're working together pretty well. There's a lot more collaboration we're seeing with builders, with the SDA providers, with the SIL organisations, bringing them all together. And those really are the most important parts of that puzzle to make sure that they're building the right property for the potential tenants that have already been identified.
Yeah. And then where does an investor start their journey in SDA? What are the steps they need to take to open that door and to make a decision if this is for them or not?
Yeah. Obviously, they need to do as much research as they can about SDA, what it is, and be comfortable that it's something for them as a relatively high risk investment. And financially, they need to be aware of what they can borrow if they're taking out a loan, or what they're willing to spend on this, and for the return on investment, and also be aware of that potential for quite, it can be months, it can be many months of vacancy in their property. So a lot of research up front is required, a lot of understanding how all the different pieces of the puzzle works. And then it's not a normal residential investment, it is a commercial investment. Different again to most other commercial investments, but it needs to be looked upon that. This is for a sophisticated investor.
Yeah. Okay. And so how does NGOs Property Australia help investors get into this space?
The education, the teaching, the information. So we have a hoard of information on our website for people to download. Information from the NDIA, that we've got a lot of links, all their different data from organisations like the Summer Foundation, who are also, they were instrumental in the very early days of putting so much information out there for people to access, to learn about SDA. We also do a lot of different reports on the data, on locations. We do financial reports for people to purchase from us. But basically, we walk people through from the beginning to the end. We explain how it all works. We tell them what they need to know, what they need to understand, how they can find that information, whether it's from us or whether they need to go to external sources to get that. We put them in touch with lenders and brokers if they need that financial assistance. So we just try to bring everything together so that they've got from like a one-stop shop of where they can come to get all the information they need to make a decision on whether it's something for them to pursue.
Yeah, wonderful. Great. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, and I look forward to asking you a lot more questions really soon.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tania.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of SDA Mastery by Tania Gomez Consulting. We hope you found this episode helpful and valuable. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, leave us a rating and share it with others. Until next time, keep learning.